This session wherein we'll start the second unit in rural marketing. In this unit we have to study about the various problems that come up which are counterproductive for the rural development initiatives in India and the schemes and policies that Indian government has implemented in the past few years to stimulate development of rural areas. We will be taking up these different topics in this particular unit in different video sessions, different lectures. So today we are only going to talk about the major problems that are there in rural India. Most of you are already aware of the kind of problems that the rural India witnesses on a daily basis. One is poverty. You can have a look at this particular picture, and if you compare the poverty figures in rural and urban India, you would find that in rural India poverty is a major problem and it's much more widespread than in urban India. In fact, some estimates published in different newspapers predict that almost 30% of the population in rural India is seriously facing this issue of poverty. There have been case studies when a particular disease in a particular family, particular illness in a particular family, illness of a particular member of the family drives the whole family below the poverty line. It pushes the whole family below the poverty line. So there have been instances of people dying of hunger in many parts of the country, including the notorious KBK belt in Orissa. So poverty is one major issue that our rural areas face, our villages face. Then undernutrition and malnutrition is another issue that the rural areas face. There's a difference between undernutrition and malnutrition. Whereas undernutrition means that you are hungry, you are not being fed properly, you are not able to satisfy your hunger because of lack of food, because of non-availability of food. Malnutrition is when you are able to satisfy your hunger, you feel satiated, your stomach is full, however you do not get the nutrients which your body requires. So you otherwise are not hungry, but your body is deficient in different nutrients because the food that you are having does not have those nutrients. So if you look at these two problems, in rural India you will find that undernutrition, again which is caused by poverty, is a major problem, and so is malnutrition, because many times when you do not have enough to food, do not have enough to feed yourself, you generally go for carbohydrate rich food which is relatively less expensive. That is why you might have found out so many daily wage earners, daily wage laborers having carbohydrate rich food consisting of rice or potatoes. On the other hand, if you have more money to spend, you generally go for protein rich diet which will include milk, cheese, meat, egg and stuff like that, and fruits and vegetables which are rich in minerals and vitamins. So generally when somebody is poor, he'll go for a carbohydrate rich diet and that is why the body is likely to be deficient in other nutrients that it requires, which include proteins, minerals and vitamins. So in a way, somebody who is suffering from undernutrition is also likely to suffer from malnutrition. Again, if you compare this situation with what happens in urban areas and let's say what happens with richer families, they do not face this issue of undernutrition, but they may still be facing this problem of malnutrition, which means that the members of the family are having adequate food supply. However, they are still not getting all the nutrients that they require because of the bad choice of food. For example, if you keep stuffing yourself with, let's say, chow mein and momo and burgers throughout the day, and you keep having alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages and various cold drinks that are available in the market, naturally you would not feel hungry. You would be able to satisfy your hunger, but the body would remain deficient in proteins, vitamins and minerals, which these kind of food generally don't have. On the other hand, you will have more than the required supply of fats and carbohydrates, which again will cause various problems. So basically, you now understand that there is a difference between undernutrition and malnutrition. While malnutrition can be a problem with richer families, undernutrition is a bigger problem with poorer families. And since a bulk of our poor live in villages and rural parts of the country, so undernutrition and malnutrition both inflict the rural population. Illiteracy rate is relatively higher in the rural areas. Almost 29% of the population is illiterate. There can be marginal difference in figures that you come across in different news websites or in different secondary sources. However, you should understand that only around 70% of the rural population is literate. And if you compare it with the figures in urban India, you would find that there is more illiteracy. People are more illiterate in the rural parts of the country. However, an illiteracy rate of 29% does not mean that 71% are very well educated. Even among those remaining 71% who are functionally literate, and to be functional literate, you simply need to do you only need to be able to do very simple things. For example, you should be able to write your name. So there are only few things that you need to do to be considered a functional literate, which means that even those who are literate, they may be able to write their names, but they are still not having requisite amount of education so that they can compete with the counterparts in the urban areas. So yes, 71% of the population is literate, but even there the literacy level is only going to help them just survive. It's not providing them skills to compete with their urban counterparts. Now then, there's a problem of abysmal quality of physical infrastructure in our villages. If some of you belong to villages, you would have come across these kind of roads, which we can see here in this particular picture. This muddy road is just not navigable in the monsoon season, and it is not going to provide around the year connectivity to this particular village. So the bad quality of roads in many villages in Uttarakhand, you would find that they are still far away from the road head. There are villages in Uttarakhand which are 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers, 5 kilometers away from the road head. So this creates a lot of problems. For example, the residents of the village, they cannot take their produce to the urban areas and sell it there. If they want to do that, they will have to incur huge costs because the roads are not navigable or roads are just not existent. If somebody is ill, then that particular person has to be carried In Uttarakhand, you must have come across these news items wherein pregnant women had to be carried on dollies to the nearest community health center just because the roads were not navigable or roads were not non-existent. So these kind of problems are there as far as rural India is concerned. Infrastructural issues are there. Electricity, again, some of the villages in Uttarakhand also, you might have come across these new items, they are not fully electrified. And the same is the case with the rest of the country also. The villages are not fully electrified. Some of the villages, they may be having the power evacuation infrastructure, the transmission infrastructure, the electric lines are there, the electric towers are there, but they still do not get round the clock electricity. So this becomes a big problem. In some of the areas in India, the farmers rely on the groundwater which they pump out using electric pump sets, but for that they need round the clock electricity availability, which is just not possible, which is just not available there in the rural areas. So this is another problem that the rural India faces. Apart from that, communication is one major issue. Naturally, since the number of customers is relatively much lower in a particular village and the customers are also not located nearby, most of the telecommunication companies, telecom service providers, they generally do not want to set up their towers, telephone towers, mobile towers in the villages, and they mostly skip the villages and rather keep on expanding their services in the urban areas. And that makes marketing sense for them also, because it is just unviable for them to erect a tower in every single village and try and provide services, mobile services to every single resident of the village. However, because of this, the communication facilities, the communication infrastructure in our villages still remains poor. So you may be able to access this particular video lecture, you may be able to access YouTube, but that may not be the case with the students who reside in villages. It is not as if the lack of physical infrastructure is the only problem. The villages also do not have sufficient social infrastructure, good quality social infrastructure available. For example, what do we mean by social infrastructure first? Schools, hospitals, dispensaries, health facilities. So these are the examples of social infrastructure. And as you can see here in this particular picture, the students in this particular school, it's a government funded school, government school in a village, and the students are sitting on the ground. They do not have desks and benches to sit on. You can have a look at the walls which are not even plastered. You can look at the books that are available to these students. So you can understand this is a kind of facilities, educational facilities that are available in the rural India. Likewise, there are so many villages which do not have a functioning primary health center, let alone a hospital. They do not even have a health center wherein somebody can go for first aid. So these are the problems that our villages have to face day in and day out. Not only is there a issue with the lack of availability of the infrastructure, but the high absenteeism, unauthorized absenteeism prevalent in government officials which are required, which have been deputed to man these facilities, teachers which have been deputed to rural schools, or the doctors or pharmacists which have been deputed to the rural dispensaries or rural community health centers or primary health centers. They've been found to absent themselves from the work without any authorization. Unauthorized absenteeism is rampant. You might have come across these kind of news items wherein during an inspection, some of the officials are found missing. Some of the teachers are found missing in some of the schools. Some of the doctors are found missing from their seats while an inspection is carried out in a particular community health center or a primary health center in a village. So apart from the problem with the social infrastructure, we are also facing this problem of unauthorized absenteeism, wherein the officers who are deputed to these schools or health facilities, they remain absent from their workplace without any authorization from the higher authorities. Ultimately, what happens is the quality of the service delivery suffers. If the teacher is not there, naturally what will happen is the students would not be able to get quality education. And this reflects in various surveys that take place on a regular basis. In one of the surveys which is conducted annually by the NGO Pratham, the survey is known by the acronym ASER, ASER, Annual Survey of Education. So in this survey it was found out that in India, in our country, specifically in the government schools, the proficiency levels of children are very, very poor. Their educational attainment is much poor. There have been cases of students not being able to read a class 5th text. A class 8 student belonging to class 8 not able to read a class 5th text. There have been instances of students not being able to solve the questions or not being able to write their own name. So this happens not only because of the lack of appropriate social infrastructure, lack of schools and colleges, it also happens because of unauthorized absenteeism on the part of the teachers who have been deputed to these schools. Another issue that is there in rural India is disguised or hidden unemployment. Now, what do we mean by disguised or hidden unemployment? Disguise means guise, G-U-I-S-E, basically means clothing. So disguise basically means you are trying to not reveal your identity. So that is the meaning of disguised. Or again, another word which is used for disguised unemployment is hidden unemployment. Now what do we mean by this? See, this particular picture shows what disguised unemployment is all about. It has been explained here. When more people are engaged in some activity than the number of persons required for that, this is called disguised unemployment. You can have a look at this particular picture. You will find on the picture on the right side, around 10 to 12 women are working on a piece of land. You can understand that this particular small piece of land can also be cultivated by only 3 or let's say 4 women. However, there are 12 to 13 women who are working here. So the remaining number of workers, here only 4 workers are adequate for this particular field. If there are 13 of them working there, so 13 minus 4, the remaining 9 are basically unemployed. Though they look like employed, but they are basically unemployed. And that is why this is called disguised unemployment. On the face of it, it looks as the person is having an employment. That person is having a job. However, there is no requirement for that person to be there because the quantity of work is much less. As you can see here in the second picture on the right, that there are 13 women. However, you need only 4. So the remaining 9 basically are actually what we term as disguised unemployment. So in a way they are unemployed. So this is also rampant in our rural areas. The reason is that the land size is limited, the population is too much. So naturally, in a family also, if there is a small piece of land, all the brothers are cultivating it. Like in the picture on the left, all the brothers are cultivating it. So naturally, the lands are getting fragmented and there are more and more number of family members dependent on the same small piece of land. And there is no other gainful employment opportunity available also. So naturally they will keep on tilling the land, and this is why we see disguised unemployment in our villages. Had these extra people who are working on these fields, had they been provided some other gainful employment opportunities, for example, had there been some kind of a food processing firm in the vicinity of the village, they could have worked there. Since such facilities are not there, they do not have any other job opportunity, they cannot look for some other option to earn their livelihood. They have no other choice but to keep on working on the same field, though their labor is not required, because the number of workers is beyond the requirement of work, beyond the amount of work that is required. So this is what is causing disguised unemployment. So this is another problem that rural India has been facing. The solution to this particular problem could be that the people who are working in villages, the ones who are contributing to disguised unemployment, they can migrate to urban areas. But then again, life is not so smooth in urban areas also. You don't get good quality jobs, well-paying jobs so easily, and the quality of life is also not that good. You can have a look at the kind of pollution levels that we are getting exposed to in our urban cities. So the quality of life is also not good. The earning opportunities are not also there. So many people, rather than migrating to the urban cities, they prefer working in the rural area. They prefer working on their traditional fields in the rural area, and this is what leads to disguised unemployment. Again, one major problem of Indian villages is the non-remunerative nature of agriculture. You can see this picture shows a farmer in a very pensive mood, and then another farmer who has committed a suicide. And farmer suicide has become one of the major reasons for unnatural deaths in India in the last few years. And the reason is that agriculture has no longer remained a remunerative vocation for them. Why is this the case? First reason is that most of the cultivation in India is still rain-fed, which means the fields are not being irrigated through some canal or through some groundwater resource. The fields are getting irrigated by the monsoon rainfall. So they are dependent, the cultivation is dependent on the rains. And in case in some particular year the rain fails or the amount of rainfall is not adequate, naturally the crop yield would also be low. So this is one reason why agriculture is still not remunerative for the farmers. Then the farmers are using the obsolete methods also. As far as seeds are concerned, they might be using the seeds that they grow. They use it in the next cropping cycle. Likewise, they may be using very obsolete methods of irrigating their fields. For example, irrigating their fields using a pump set and drawing water from the ground, which again is going to be a more wasteful use of water. There are newer techniques, for example drip irrigation, wherein less amount of water is required and you can use the water very efficiently. However, these farmers do not have access to, they are either unaware of these kind of practices or they are not having access to these kind of methods and techniques, and because of which they keep on using the traditional methods which do not yield them good results, which do not lead to a bumper production, a bumper crop production or a bumper harvest. So this is another reason why agriculture remains non-remunerative for our farmers. Again, in the quest to increase the yield, many farmers keep on applying fertilizers, and they apply fertilizers without giving a thought to the nutrient profile of the soil. So if you have to apply fertilizers, you have to apply fertilizers according to the nutrient profile of the soil. For example, if the soil is missing in nitrogen, however it has sufficient quantity of potassium and phosphorus, then you don't need to provide potassic or phosphatic fertilizers. You only need to provide fertilizers which can provide nitrogen to the soil. However, in India, the use of fertilizers is generally without giving a thought to the nutrient profile of the soil and the nutrient requirements of the soil, because of which, number one, there is a waste of fertilizers, because you apply fertilizers, the soil may not need those fertilizers, and secondly, it will also cause soil pollution and underground water pollution, because the fertilizers which are being overused, they would ultimately seep down and they would ultimately pollute the groundwater resources. So this is another reason why agriculture has remained non-remunerative for farmers here in India. Again, the farmers do not have sufficient marketing skills to market their product, to market their produce, to sell their produce, because of which they are not able to fetch sufficient returns for their hard work, for their labor. And the irony of this is that most of the farmers, they generally tend to sell to intermediaries, middlemen. While the farmers earn just a penny for their produce, the middlemen profit a lot because they earn huge margins on the trading that they do in this particular manner. They buy from the farmers and then they sell it to some other trader. In this whole process, it is the middleman that earns the most. In fact, it is being said about India that whereas the farmers don't earn a lot from their produce, in fact they earn only pennies for the hard work that they put in their fields. The consumers, the end consumers who consume the food items, they also have to pay a lot of amount to purchase these food items. You can have a look at the food inflation figures in India in the last few years. The middleman, the intermediary, profits the most. So this is one reason why the farmers need to be educated, need to be provided marketing skills, so that they can market their products in a better manner without depending on the intermediary. We will discuss later on how the government is working on reducing the dependence of farmers on the intermediaries to sell their products. So the time is ripe for the farmers to be provided these skills, wherein using these skills they can actually market their product and get good returns for their hard work. Again, distress selling is one more feature which is seen very often in rural India. In rural India, most of the farmers are small farmers. Most of them, the size of land holding that they own is less than 2 hectares. So these farmers, they basically live from hand to mouth. What does this mean? This means that they earn from a particular cropping cycle by selling their produce in the market, and then they use the money that they earn in this particular manner to buy seeds and other inputs for the next cropping cycle. So let's say in March, April, when they have sold the Rabi crop, the money that they have received from the selling of the Rabi crop, they will have to use part of that money to feed their own family, and part of it will be used to buy inputs for the next cropping cycle, which is the Jed, in the May and the June season. So they will have to buy seeds, they might have to buy, for example, fertilizers, manures, pesticides. So all these inputs will have to be bought with the money that they earn in the last cropping cycle. Now, which means that if the farmer's produce doesn't get sold in the month of March or April, what will happen? he will simply not have sufficient money to buy inputs for the next cropping cycle, and so there are chances that his activities in the next cropping cycle may have to suffer. His next crop that he is planning to sow, that may have to suffer. To ensure that this does not happen, the farmer will have to go for distress selling of his products. So what does this mean? He will have to sell his products despite not being satisfied with the price he is getting for his produce in the market. He might not be able to extract good prices for his produce in the market, but still he will be distressed enough and he will be forced to sell that produce in the market so that he can then buy inputs for the next cropping cycle. This is called distress selling, and that is why farmers are so dependent on the intermediaries, because if the intermediaries do not buy their product, they will be left with the product, which means they would not be able to earn any money to invest in the next cropping cycle, and that is why they are at the mercy of the intermediaries, and the intermediaries bargain for very low prices from the farmers. And so despite having worked very hard in the fields, the farmers are not able to earn sufficient returns for their labor. Again, one major problem with the farmers here in India is that they also face huge difficulty in accessing credit. Many a times they may require credit for the next cropping cycle to purchase agricultural inputs. Many a times they might want to purchase agriculture machinery which may increase the efficiency, which may help them increase their efficiency or may help them increase their yields. But for that they might require credit which is not easily accessible and available in the rural parts of the country. They may not have a bank or some other financing agency nearby. Even if they are able to access these banks, the banks demand some kind of a security before providing loans. So it becomes very difficult for the farmers to access credit, and that is why in our rural parts the farmers many times will have to rely on the local money lenders, the sahukars, the shroffs, for these kind of credit requirements. Many a times there might be various functions in the family of the farmers, and for that also they may require credit. It could be the marriage of a son or a daughter, it could be the illness of a family member. So in all these times they find it really difficult to access credit from the banks and other service providers, and so they have to depend on the local sahukars. And the problem with these local sahukars and shroffs is that they charge a huge rate of interest, and in the event that the farmer is not able to repay the loan amount, the land is taken away from the farmer. The land is snatched from the farmer by the money lender. So this is one big problem that our farmers have been facing, and because of this we have seen a spurt in farmer suicides in the last few years, and this has also become a big issue. And this one particular issue is one which many of the state governments as well as the national government, they are trying to resolve. Again, since the agriculture is non-remunerative, there is not sufficient availability of credit in the rural areas. You also do not have a good quality physical infrastructure. The health and educational facilities, health and education infrastructure is also missing. So ultimately this forces the people in the rural areas to migrate to the urban parts of the country. And that is why around 10, 15, 20 years ago, 80% of the Indian population resided in villages. Now the figure is just 70%, which means around 20, 20 years ago, only 20% of our population resided in villages. Now it is almost 30% of our population which resides in the urban areas. So earlier 20% only resided in the urban areas, now it is 30% which are residing in the urban areas, and it is expected that by the year 2050, around half of our population would be residing in urban areas. And this wave of migration is happening on a steady basis. So many people are migrating from the rural to the urban areas. This to an extent is okay, and this happens in a developing economy. People tend to migrate from rural areas wherein they generally are engaged in primary activities to urban areas where generally they get engaged in secondary activities, manufacturing activities or service sector. However, this creates its own problem. Number one, the social fabric gets disturbed. Some family members are left behind in the villages, while generally the people from the younger generation, they move to the urban parts. So the family gets disturbed. This is number one. And secondly, too much of migration from the rural to the urban areas would ultimately lead to a breakdown of civic facilities in the urban areas. If you go to Delhi, you will find, and if you step in a bus or some public transport, you would find there is a lot of crowd there. So because of this influx of migrants from the rural to the urban areas, the civic amenities in the urban areas, they break down. They are simply not able to withstand the pressure of the rural migration. So this is another problem which not only impacts the rural life, but eventually it goes on to impact the urban life also, because more migration to urban areas would ultimately put too much pressure on the civic infrastructure in the urban areas, and thereby the original inhabitants of these urban areas will have to face problems. So that is why, though rural to urban migration happens in a developing economy, if it is happening at too fast a pace, which is the case with India, this is not considered to be a good sign, good omen. Now, this is one example of a ghost village in Uttarakhand. Why is this particular village being called a ghost village? Because all the residents of this particular village have already migrated to urban areas, and there is nobody left behind. In fact, around 2-3 years ago, a particular commission was set up in Uttarakhand to find out the extent of migration from rural areas of Uttarakhand, from villages in Uttarakhand to urban areas, and it was found out that around 600 villages have now turned into ghost villages, and 100% of the population in these villages has migrated to urban areas. So the idea behind talking about ghost village in Uttarakhand is to make you understand the extent of this problem that here in India we are facing of migration from rural to urban areas. So these are the various problems that the rural areas in India face, and the issues which need to be tackled at the earliest if we have any dreams, if we harbor any dreams of developing our rural countryside. Thank you very much. In the next session, we will be discussing the various policies and the schemes and the various other initiatives taken by the government to stimulate rural development.